Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rob Smith. I'm a contributor at Turning Point USA in the First and the author of the upcoming book, Always a Soldier, which is an Iraq War memoir that I'm very proud of. But this is not about me. I'm here today with former Speaker of the House and 2012 presidential candidate, Newt Gingrich. Newt is a Fox News contributor and the author of 40 books, including his new New York Times bestselling book, Trump and the American Future, this guy right here, which came out on June 23rd. Newt, I'm glad to be with you to talk about your new book and answer some fan questions. And I want everybody to know that Newt's new book, Trump and the American Future, you can get a signed copy of that at premiercollectibles.com/American Future. So thank you so much for joining me for this, Mr. Speaker. And first, to start, tell us a little bit about your new book and why you decided to write it at this moment right now.
Well, it actually turned out to be more relevant than I thought it would. I started back in November thinking that this was going to be an extraordinary election and that a book which outlined what was at stake would be very helpful to people who support President Trump, would give them the facts and the information and the context to win arguments with their friends. And then we almost finished the book in February and suddenly realized with the Chinese virus causing huge changes in our society, causing basically a depression, that you had to rethink it. So we wrote about a third of the book over to take into account where we are now. And I really feel good about it because I think this is the most significant election since Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and 1864. And I say that because I think the difference between a Biden, Pelosi, Schumer team and where they would take America and a Trump, McConnell, McCarthy team, the gap is so enormous that not since the choice of Lincoln have we had something which was as dramatically different as these two futures would be. So that's why I wrote it. I'm very pleased with it. It became a New York Times bestseller the very first week. So it was very, very gratifying. And lots of people have told me that they found the book really helpful.
Right. So to dive in a little bit, you said that, there's a huge choice. This is the Trump, McConnell versus Biden, Pelosi, Schumer. What do you think are going to be the biggest differences between those choices, I think, in the eyes of the voters? So what decisions do they have to make? How different would these two presidencies be, in your opinion?
Well, I think part of it's going to be come back to COVID and the sense they have of whether or not we're getting it under control. And there, frankly, the propaganda media, which has replaced the news media, has been so relentlessly hostile to Trump. It's very hard to tell what's going on. My younger daughter, Jackie Cushman, just sent me a note today from an old computer term, garbage in, garbage out, and said the data we're getting is so totally flawed and so dishonest. But COVID will be an issue. Trump did an amazing job of mobilizing the private sector, whether it's pharmaceutical companies bringing in therapies and vaccines, or it's manufacturing companies producing enormous quantities of personal protective gear and masks and what have you. We went from a real deficit left us by the Obama-Biden team, who had failed to replace about 100 million masks that they used back in an earlier epidemic. And so Trump had to sort of both refill what should have been there and then move on to pretty remarkable stuff. That'll be one thing. I think a second thing will be the economy. Trump had us to a point where in February, this is what made it so frustrating. In February, I was writing this really easy book, lowest Black unemployment rate in history, lowest Latino unemployment rate in history, people at the bottom of the ladder getting 15% pay raises. Things were really pretty good. And then, of course, we had a government-imposed depression as a result of the Chinese virus. And we're now moving towards recovery. And some of the numbers are pretty good. Today, there were some good numbers on manufacturing, but it's a long way back up. And so one of the questions is going to be, do we trust Trump to get us back to the prosperity we had in February? or do we want to take a flyer on a much more liberal, high tax, big government, virtually socialist approach, which Biden and Pelosi and Schumer have? I think the third issue is the one that the president really struck a nerve with when he went out to Mount Rushmore. And that is, do you favor America and the concept that America has been, the Constitution, the historic achievements, or do you favor replacing America with something very, very different? And I think it's very interesting. The president was very, I thought, strategically clever to propose a statue park, because it allows us to draw the contrast and say, look, we're the team that wants to build statues. They're the team that wants to tear down statues. You decide which is better for America. If there are some gaps, maybe we should put up new statues of people to fill the gaps rather than tear down old statues. I think that's going to be that whole question about how anti-American they become. And then the fourth big issue is going to be crime. You've had 2 weekends ago, we had 152 Americans killed or wounded in Chicago and New York alone. This last weekend, we had a terrible increase in crime. New York had the bloodiest Monday it's had since before Giuliani was mayor. The fact is, only about 12% of the country really wants to deeply defund the police. Mm-hmm. About 14% are willing to cut them a little bit, but 75% of the country is opposed to cutting the police force. And yet Biden and the Democrats are clearly, in fact, I have a chapter talking about the fact that they're clearly anti-police and pro-criminal. Mm-hmm. And it's true, it's astonishing, but it is true. So that'll be a huge issue by this fall, I think.
So getting into that idea about defunding the police, why do you think that since such a small minority of people really sort of subscribe to that defund the police movement, why do you think that that movement has gotten so much traction on the left and with the Democrats?
I think that the left gets traction for two reasons. One is that the former news media turned propaganda media is increasingly occupied by people who share these radical anti-American views. And we just had a letter written by a former editor of the New York Times, which was devastating, in which he described the almost fascist-like mind control. And I do a free series of podcasts at Gingrich 360, and we're about to launch a whole new series called Shut Your Mouth, where we just take case after case after case where these left-wing fascists go out and either get people fired, harass them. You saw with the Goya boycott. I mean, if you say the wrong thing, boy, these people after you. What makes that work is the propaganda media, and the second thing that makes it work is ferocity. When you have people who get in your face, normal Americans don't particularly want to be involved in fights, and so their natural instinct in peacetime is to back up a half step. And these are people who then take that step and stay in your face. So you've had very intense, I mean, it's amazing. If you look around the country, the number of student body presidents who are resigning, because even though they're only students, they're either, a number of them are Jewish, and the anti-Semitism of the anti-American left is very real. A number of them are just nice, pleasant people who, you know, if you say all lives matter, you're clearly hated, and you therefore can't stay in office, and the left will mobilize against you and drive you out of office. So I think it's the combination of the enormous power of the media and the ferocity of the people on the left who really are fascist. I mean, they're very prepared to use force if necessary to impose their will.
Okay. So I want to get back to the COVID-19 pandemic, because obviously that's something that completely radically shifted how you were writing the book. So the pandemic plays a significant role in your book. What have you learned since you finished the book, and what are the most important aspects of the pandemic that you think that people should learn from and focus on? And furthermore, in your opinion, how far out do you think that we are in America from some sense of normalcy and kind of getting beyond this?
Well, let me say, first of all, that I think we have a pretty strong chapter in Trump and the American Future on the Chinese virus and what happened and how it happened. I wrote from a particular perspective because I'm talking to you from Rome, where my wife Callista is the ambassador to the Vatican. And Italy was very hard hit. There are about 100,000 Chinese workers in northern Italy. And as a result, they were deeply hit by the virus very early. And unlike Trump, who closed down the airlines, the Italians kept the airlines from China open. So they were literally just flying in people who had the virus. Mm-hmm. When it finally got really bad in the northern Italy area between Milano and Bergamo, they closed the whole country down. So for about 10 weeks, we were locked up. And Calista ran the embassy virtually. I did all my work by Skype and Zoom and GoToMeeting. And they had grocery stores, pharmacies, and gas stations open. Everything else was closed. If you were out on the street, you had to have a written explanation of why you were out there. And if it wasn't valid, they could fine you up to $3,200. So this was a big deal. The way it ultimately ended up working out, the virus began to recede. They've now reopened everything. You can go to you can go to movies, museums, restaurants, and you go out today. I was out today, and people were all over the place. So there's still people who wear masks, but there are also a lot of people who don't wear masks. So I think there's hope here. I find it really hard. I'm glad you asked me about COVID-19 because my younger daughter, Jackie Cushman, is a certified financial analyst and used to run a $1 billion budget for a Bell South TNT joint venture. So she's really good with numbers and with analysis. And she sent me a note the other day and said, garbage in, garbage out, which is an old computer term. And what she meant was, and we just saw this in Florida, apparently, for some bizarre reason, every hospital in Florida reported wrong.
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Well, I don't know how it happened, but apparently they moved the decimal. So 7.8 became 78. So all of these scare stories in the media were based on false reporting. Now, why the false reporting occurred and why it didn't occur to somebody to say, wait a second, there's no hospital in the country that has a 78% positive. But the media, in my judgment, the media is so desperate to beat Trump that they have made COVID for the United States 5 or 6 times harder than it should be. And I think somebody will someday do a media pandemic analysis and will realize that the two great culprits are the American media and Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo presided over policies that killed more people than any other state in the country by a huge margin. But he's
and why do you think? Yeah, and why do you think that Governor Cuomo has gotten such a pass for his terrible handling of the pandemic in New York?
I think because, first of all, he's New York, and a great deal of the media is New York. Even the Washington media, much of it comes out of New York. I think second, his brother has a full-time show on CNN. I think third, if you watch the media, they attack Ron DeSantis, who's had about 10% of the death rate of Cuomo, but he is a Trump Republican. Cuomo, who is a liberal left-wing Democrat, can do no wrong. So even though 10 times as many people died in New York, they skip past Cuomo and say, oh my God, look what DeSantis is doing. And that's why I think it's going to be interesting to watch this summer. Michael Barone is one of the great students of American politics and invented the Almanac of American Politics, wrote a column last week and said, this is the most dishonest news media in his lifetime. That he is startled at how dishonest it is and that they will pay a price for it. And I think part of that price, will come in July and early August as people realize they're being frightened by a media that wants them scared. But that in fact, there's no good reason to be scared. There was just a report that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine that said there's no evidence that children transmit the disease to older people. None.
Right.
And yet this whole thing about should we reopen the schools? Well, I think it is crazy to think you're going to keep all these kids locked up and uneducated and think that that's good public health. And so obviously you have to reopen the schools. That'll be a big fight because the teachers unions in many places will be deeply opposed. And it's going to cause a big problem for Biden. I mean, is he really going to be willing to take on the teachers union when they basically own the Democratic Party? Or how's he going to sidestep this? But Trump's instinct here is totally right. And that's why when I wrote Trump and the American Future, I had a section on school choice, why it's important, how much the unionized big city schools have failed. And I think if we're going to compete with China, we have to reform our education system.
Right. Okay, so moving on a little bit, and by the way, you guys can still pick this book up right now. Moving on a little bit from COVID-19. So in your book, you talk about an ideology in the Democrat Party which hates police and protects criminals. How does this relate to the massive protests that we've seen about police misconduct across the country? And what is the best way to restore trust in law enforcement while making sure that not only African Americans, but all Americans are treated fairly by law enforcement?
Well, I think, first of all, I favor having a body camera on every policeman. I think if you had, full coverage of their entire day, then you'd know pretty rapidly what's the truth. And I favor better training, but I actually think we need more police, not fewer. I don't see how you can look at the murder rate in Chicago, which lost 18 dead in one Sunday, the worst since 1950, and not think that we had better do something to protect people. At the same time, I would say that we need to tell the truth about this. I want to answer your question in two different ways. The truth is, you are 300 times, if you're a young black male, you are 300 times more likely to be killed by a criminal than by a policeman.
Yes.
And that we recently had an 8-year-old child killed in Atlanta, a 7-year-old child killed in Chicago, a 30-month-old child killed in New York. None of those were killed by policemen. But you don't find Black Lives Matter because it's not politically an interesting story. Yet the children are dead. The second thing I think is that there is a genuine, deep hostility. I mean, when Biden had 13 members of his staff who gave money to help bail out looters and violent people in Minneapolis. It happens to be a fact that in New York, they've adopted a no bail rule, which means you automatically get back out. So they're you check in, you're charged with armed robbery, and you're back on the street 3 hours later. They had one bank robber who robbed a bank a day for 6 straight days, got picked up every single time, and got released every single time. And finally said to the policeman the 6th time, "What do you have to do for him to keep you?" I mean, I think he was actually trying to go back to prison where he felt safer and people fed him and he was taken care of. But you look at all this stuff, the group of violent people take over part of Seattle, and the mayor talks about the summer of love. And of course, 4 people were killed in that area. And then although the real thing that got to her was that the same demonstrators came to her home at night. And by 2 o'clock in the morning, she had decided it was time to close down the area because she was now personally being threatened. And I think that's a key part of it.
Yeah,
so
the summer of love is over.
A guy like de Blasio, who is a radical Democrat in New York, I just think he's insane. I mean, I don't think there's any rational way to explain how de Blasio behaves.
Yeah. So moving on a little bit from that, and as somebody who lived in New York for 12 years, I actually came down to Florida when the pandemic happened. I lived in New York in the tail end of the Bloomberg administration, and then I've seen the decline of New York with my own 2 eyes under de Blasio, and I fear for the future of New York. So I want to kind of move on to I'm gonna ask you one more question, and then I want to go to some some of the questions that some of our viewers are asking right now.
Okay.
And this one will take it back to the book. So, this is Trump and the American future. So this is about the future of America under a potential second presidency or second term for Donald Trump. If he wins in 2020, if he wins in this November, what are your top predictions for things that he could accomplish in a second term? And what do you think that he should focus on in a second term?
Well, I think, first of all, he will focus on dramatically greater economic growth. I think he really understands that if everybody had a job and everybody had take-home pay, it's just a better country. It's an easier country.
Yes.
Second, I think he's going to probably come in with a very large infrastructure program because we're way behind the Chinese on infrastructure. And I think we have to catch up with them on transportation, on roads, on airfields, et cetera. Third, I think he will really continue this fight over the culture war that we're in now. And I think you'll see him become much more aggressive about colleges that teach things that are fake, and much more aggressive about educators who, in fact, are basically Marxist advocates and not really teaching anything that's real. And then lastly, I think, and as part of that, I think he'll be deeply involved in strengthening the police. But I also think it's very likely that they're going to continue their outreach and try to develop a better way of life. I think, I think the president is deeply bothered by the fact that we've not been able to solve Southside Chicago or solve inner city Baltimore. These are Americans. They deserve a better life. The fact that they currently have Democratic mayors and local governments that are disasters doesn't mean the president of the United States shouldn't be concerned about his citizens getting a decent life. And I think you'll see more involvement in the inner cities in a second Trump term.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that, definitely needs to happen. Okay, so let's go to some questions that people have asked, and I'm going to pull up their names. This is actually okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask this, and it will be really interesting to get your opinion on this. Alan from Westfield, Indiana wants to know, is the world in the middle of a Marxist globalist revolution?
Well, Alan, no, it's not. You have a very left-wing revolution underway in the United States. In Europe, if anything, it's going to the right, and you have a populist conservatism. In China, there's a total dictatorship, so nothing counts. In Russia, there's pretty big dictatorship, so nothing counts. In India, you have sort of a Hindu conservatism, but not a Marxist revolution. In Latin America, I think you have places that are trying to move towards capitalism. Brazil would be an example. And then you have places that are just a disaster, like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. But I don't think there's a worldwide revolution. I think the United States, in that sense, is out of sync, and we've had 3 generations of brainwashed students, and the result has been that they run around saying things that are just untrue, but they believe them, and they got A's on their exams for saying them. So it's a little bit hard to break them loose.
Yeah, and I don't think that you can't overplay the role that universities and colleges have in brainwashing these kids and indoctrinating them into leftist ideology. With Turning Point USA, we see it all the time. We have them try to shut down the Turning Point USA chapters. They come and they try to shut down our events. It's actually quite insane. And on that note, what do you think that conservatives and people that love America need to do to sort of turn the tide when it comes to what our kids are being taught in colleges and universities?
Well, I think we have to be prepared to fight.
Yeah.
And by fight, I mean things as simple as I would encourage every student to tape every class. I mean, if you're taking a course from a professor who clearly is saying things that are false, you ought to be able to report that. You'll be able to go to the provost or the dean and say, look, this is what he said or she said yesterday in class. Now, the professors will all go crazy, but you now have about 25% of the professors openly say they're Marxist.
Yeah.
Well, second, I would say to everybody who normally gives to colleges and universities, why are you giving money to people to teach your grandchildren to have contempt for you?
Mm-hmm.
Or why don't you get together and take control back? Because
Yeah.
look, the board of trustees of all these schools could take control back if they had the guts, but they'd have to be in a real fight because the entire left would go crazy. So,
Yeah.
but I think short of that kind of activity, we're not going to take the country back. And then I think we have to also have a very, very aggressive effort against the new racism that is basically anti-white and that
Mm-hmm.
has, that has people telling somebody that in order to have a job, you have to take a course to teach you to despise yourself. Has to be a violation both of free speech and of the 14th Amendment on due process. And I think we need to be much tougher about suing and about putting these people on defense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so back to Trump in the book. I don't have this person's name and where they came from, but they wanted to know, what do you think that Trump has to do between now and election day in order to win re-election?
I think he has to do, assuming he can keep the economy growing and assuming that we gradually get more comfortable with the Chinese virus, he has to do basically three things. I think he has to be more disciplined in what he tweets and getting into these really dumb fights that don't make any they don't do him any good.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I think he needs to offer a bold vision of what a second administration will be like. People want to vote on the future. They don't want to know what you did for them. They want to know what's the next round going to be like. And I think he has to have a much more vivid and clear sense of the next round. And then third, I think he's got to draw a very sharp contrast with the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer team. And he's doing a pretty decent job of that and getting people to understand just how disastrous in practical ways, I mean, disastrous in crime, disastrous in changing the whole nature of the country, disastrous in having huge tax increases that would cripple the economy for a generation. And a lot of really practical differences. Pelosi got 207 Democrats in the House to vote with her on a $3 trillion bill, which, among other things, has a Pelosi bonus of $1,200 for every illegal immigrant. So if you can get into the U.S. illegally, Nancy Pelosi wants to give you a check for $1,200. Well,
Insane.
There can't be 10 districts in the country that think that makes any sense. So I think if Republicans focus, they might end up doing astonishingly well.
So, and this is a very interesting question, and I kind of get this question a lot from a lot of people that they look at that, iconic sort of figures like yourself, and then they look at people that are in the media eye to a lesser extent, like myself, and they say, well, you're doing all this stuff, you're writing books, you're on Fox News all the time. So Patricia from Placentia, California wants to ask, what can I do as a small person to help solve our country's problems? I.e., just I'm your average run-of-the-mill American. What can I do to help save our country?
There are no small people. Every citizen has the opportunity to make a difference. Part of why I wrote Trump and the American Future, is to arm people so they can go win arguments. But there you go. Everything from calling in on talk radio to writing letters to the editor, to talking to your friends and neighbors, to setting up your own website. People have an impact. Many of the people we now think of as famous weren't famous when they started. And so I would say to her, your state is such a total mess. That's sort of, I would think a sort of a free us from Newsom website might draw an amazing number of people signing up. It might make her pretty famous. But no American should ever think that they're small. Every American is as big as their dreams and their work ethic and their courage take them to be. And you're not guaranteed success in this country, but you sure are guaranteed the right to go out and try.
Well, it's a really amazing and positive and inspiring message. I'm pretty sure Patricia's watching. She'd appreciate that. I appreciated it myself. Okay, I'm going to ask you one more of these, and then we can kind of go couple more of these, and then I'll kind of go into a rapid fire round. Okay, so, and this is going back in line to the stuff about colleges right now. So a younger person asked, what advice would you recommend to youths with conservative viewpoints who are about to start college in the fall?
I would recommend first check out the colleges until you find one you want. There are, in Liberty University, for example, now has an enormous enrollment because people are looking for a conservative college. There are a lot of other places like that that are now available. Also, look online and see what's available there. And you know, I'm a big fan of what has been done at Purdue, where Mitch Daniels, one of the two best university presidents in the country. I'm a big fan of what Michael Crow's done at Arizona State, which is the largest university in the country now. So I would simply say, don't be intimidated, and insist on finding a place that actually teaches in a fair way, and it gives you a chance to learn the things you believe in.
Great. And this is actually, this question is very interesting because, we have people like the Nancy Pelosi's and the Maxine Waters of the world who've literally been sitting in Congress for decades. So what are your thoughts on congressional term limits?
I can live with 12-year term limits because it gives you time to learn enough, and you would change the nature of who gets elected because you'd have more senior people running. I would be very cautious about anything much short of that. In states that have tried very short term limits, 6 years or 8 years, what happens is legislating is actually very, very complicated because you have to get all these people to agree. And in places that have very short term limits, what happens is you end up with the bureaucrats and the lobbyists running the place because the legislators never learn enough. And so they're basically handed solutions that the lobbyists and the legislators like. I mean, the lobbyists and the so that would be my view. We had term limits in the contract with America in 1994. We promised we'd vote on it, and we did, but we never got anywhere close to a constitutional majority. And support for it kind of collapsed because once we had beaten the Democrats for the first time in 40 years, people felt like, gee, elections did work, and I can, so they actually got more interested just in winning elections rather than term limits. I think because of Pelosi in particular, the degree to which people dislike her, there's probably a rising interest in term limits.
Okay, one more of these, and then we'll go into some rapid fire questions. How can we bring more people back to conservative values?
Talk to them, and look for the obvious. I mean, they used to say in the 70s that a conservative was a liberal who'd been mugged. So I would start and say, if you believe in the work ethic, you ought to be a conservative. If you believe in take-home pay, you ought to be a conservative. If you think criminals are dangerous and that police are necessary, you ought to be a conservative. If you worry about China as a competitor and you think that we have to strengthen our defense as opposed to Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader who's now co-sponsoring a 10% cut in defense. I mean, it's fascinating to me. They want to defund the police at home and defund the military overseas. I mean, it's almost like anybody who protects us, they want to get rid of, leaving a huge gap with criminals and the Chinese.
So, okay, last question. This is from Valerie in Wesley Chapel, Florida, who says, will you please run for president in 2024?
No, but I hope she will help elect Trump this year. And I'm very honored that she would think that, and I hope that will inspire her to tell all of her friends about Trump and the American future.
Okay, so let's do this for the last 5 to 10 minutes or so. So here's some rapid fire questions, and we'll give you maybe like a minute to answer each. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Never give up.
Perfect. What is your biggest pet peeve?
I can't lose weight.
Yeah, join the club. Name a book that you've read that's positively changed you.
Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive changed my life. I read it in 1969, and I reread it about 4 more times. It's 168 pages. I recommend it to anybody. It's the best single book on how to be effective. It's called The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker, and it literally gave me the skills to do everything I've done since then.
The Effective Executive. So is that more business oriented or self-help or personal,
No,
or kind of all the above?
it's how do you get things done,
Yeah.
whatever they are. It's a remarkable work. It's a work of a genius.
The Effective Executive. I'm going to remember that. If you had a superpower, what would it be?
If I had a superpower, gosh, that is actually a pretty cool one. So as long as I'm going to have a fancified superpower, it'll be reading minds.
Reading minds. Wow.
I'd love to be able to walk into rooms and read minds.
Well, if you had the superpower to read minds, you would have to run for president in 2024, because then you know what everybody wanted.
No, I would just be able to read the president's mind. I wouldn't have to go do all that work.
Presidents there you go.
They have to work hard.
It seems like, what do they call it? The world's worst job. Who is your biggest?
I'm sorry, I think you just froze.
You got me? Are we breaking up a little bit?
Well, you did there for a second. Now you're back.
Oh, that was me. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you said yours.
Yeah, who is your biggest inspiration in life?
Poof. Well, probably my stepfather, who was an infantryman for 27 years.
Infantry, wow, 27 years.
Yeah, and he convinced me you have to love the country and sacrifice for the country, and that it's a great honor to be an American.
It's brilliant. I could only hack it 5 years in the infantry. So,
yeah.
What's a secret talent that you have?
Secret talent?
Secret talent. You a secret juggler?
No, actually I'm pretty boring. I don't think I have any secret talents. That makes me feel bad.
Oh no, you're not.
I mean, my secret hobby would be playing with animals, but I don't know that I have any talents.
Well, so your secret talent is that you're a secret Dr. Dolittle. There you go. You got the animal skills. Okay, so last rapid fire question. What is one thing on your bucket list?
To see orangutans in Borneo.
Wow. Fantastic.
Yeah, I tell my wife that. By the way, before we get done, Rob, I do want to remind everybody who's watching, you have a brand new book coming out, Always a Soldier, and that's also going to be available. And you've had a great, you are one of the shining stars of conservatism who I think is going to really make a difference in the country. And so I hope people will take a serious look at Always a Soldier.
I really, really appreciate that endorsement from you. So yeah, you guys can check that out. It's also available right by where Newt's book is. So we've got about 5 more minutes, and I want to give people the money's worth. So the last question that I want to ask you is, actually, no, you already asked you already answered the question about Abraham Lincoln. So final pitch, Trump and the American Future. Why is this book important? Why should more people purchase it? And what do you think that people will get from it?
Well, I think if you are concerned about America's future, if you realize that the propaganda media is going to be pounding on the president, lying about him, distorting things every single day from now to the election, if you want to have the facts and the context and the arguments to sit down with your friends and your neighbors and explain what the news media will never tell them, then I think that Trump and the American Future gives you really a workbook. Think of it as a citizen's workbook for the campaign. And I think it does so in a way that's both interesting, but also is very, very informative.
Fantastic.
So I hope is watching will not only buy a copy, I hope they will, send an email out to all their friends or Facebook or whatever, and let them know that they should also buy a copy.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it looks like we're wrapping up here. The first thing that I want to do is just say to you, thank you so much for all you've done, and thank you for giving us all this time and sharing your expertise with us. It is greatly appreciated.
It was great fun. Thank you, Rob. Good luck with
Thank
your
you,
book.
and thank you very much. So both of these books are available. First of all, Trump and the American Future, already a New York Times bestseller book, and Always a Soldier, my book, a Iraq War memoir, political commentary from everything about the Black vote in 2020 to why I came out as a conservative, Trump supporting Black Republican, to what it was like serving in Iraq. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you all out
Thank you.
there, and pick up both of these books.
Great. Take care.
Have
Bye-bye.
a good one.